with us on the panel, which is called Democracy, Corruption, Unity, Ukrainian Realities versus Appearances. We have with us Metropolitan Epiphanius, the head of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Oleksandra Matviichuk, who is the head of the board for the Center for Civil Liberties, the organization which won the Nobel Prize in 2022, and as well the member of the Parliament of the Kingdom of Sweden, Gustaf Göthberg, which may sound a bit unorthodox panel, an unusual group of speakers, but I understand why you're all here. And as I said, thank you for being here. We have slightly 20 minutes with the questions. But I want to start with the democracy and with the unity. Unfortunately, it feels like also during this panel, sometimes by some of our friends and allies, that democracy is used as an excuse not to act, saying we're very slow, our parliaments are there is chaotic, there is something going on because we are democracies. However, we still try to stress that this war is of the democracies against autocracies. So I want to think about democracy in a different way as our strengths, because we understand that if Ukraine hasn't been democracy, how much of you would be today here in this room as a Ukrainian allies? I bet maybe some, but majority probably not. The same goes to the Ukrainian armed forces. If the Ukrainian armed forces hadn't been reformed, if we didn't do that what has been done in 2014, who knows whether the Ukrainian army would, pursue. And therefore, I want to ask everybody, with all the constraints, in this room, the room of friends, it's not the place where we need to show how great we are, but also to show where do you see the strengths of the Ukrainian democracy, but also the concerns and also the red lines, because it's a second year of the war. The political discussions are back in Ukraine, and at the same time, we understand that the time of the emotional unity is over. It's time for the pragmatic unity, but how to keep it? So first, Блаженнейший, the Metropolitan Epiphanius, I ask you to start.
Yes, if we discuss democracy today, we discuss certain values. We all would like to live in a democratic country where we have guaranteed freedoms and justice. But discussing democracy, we should also have a free Ukrainian state and freedom, because the gift of freedom is a great gift from God, and we have to preserve it, and you have to multiply it, pass it on to posterity. And church is part and parcel of civil society, because democracy envisions the situation when democratic situation contributes to governance and participates in it directly. Church is inseparable from the civil society, and in such difficult circumstances as a church, we live through the same hardships and suffering, but we are sure that Ukraine shall overcome this. The issue is this, to be or not to be. We are prepared to be, and we trust in that. It's the 10th anniversary from the beginning of this war, and we can say that this fight has been on for some decades. The enemy tried to destroy us as a people in their own right, as a nation. For 300 years, but we have preserved our identity, and we are proclaiming our willingness and to build our state. So, learning from our objective history, even 100 years ago, for a short time we had our independence. Unfortunately, we lost it because of internal inconsistencies and lack of unity. 100 years ago, we could not hold the line, and as a result of that, we had genocide and artificial famine who took the toll of million lives. And now we are paying a very high price for freedom. Even one human life is a too high price to pay. But without resisting the aggressor, we can end up paying even more, million times more. And as the Ukrainian Church, we are calling up for unity. And we have this demand from the society that we feel for unity. Recently, I visited Chernivtsi, and we were joining 3 dioceses in one. And of course, the enemy was trying to use psychological information operations against us, but in unity we stay strong and will be able to deter and defeat the enemy. So this is a great time, the best time for implementation of any reforms. Last year we had the calendar reform. That was a very difficult reform for our church. But what we can see now is that the society appreciated actually to such an extent that even the clergy could not expect. So this is high time to implement reforms and fight the internal enemies, and this is corruption as our internal enemy that corrodes us from inside. And we made our choice at 2 Maidans. This European vector, we're paying a very high price now, but God in truth is in God, and with God we will have victory.
Oleksandra, you speaking a lot in various places, explaining what's going on, what the horrific, war crimes are happening in Ukraine. But in this audience, you don't need to persuade anybody. So I think the people are they really want to know where we are now as a society, how united, what are our red lines, where we're looking. There are things maybe going the other way. What would be the signs for you? And what are you also concerned from your position?
We are approaching the 2nd anniversary of large-scale invasion in very critical conditions. People in Ukraine are fighting for freedom and for human dignity and have been repealing the multi-million nuclear weapons state for 10 years already. Russia are destroying our cities, burning our grain, and killing our families. We were waiting for a first modern tanks for the whole 2022, and yet we have not received the modern plane from our allies. Those who promised us that they will be with us as long as it takes now are busy with their own elections. But we have no luxury to be tired, because if we stop fighting, there will be no more us. And as we speak about some internal challenge, I will speak about unity as well, because it's illusion that war is united. The war is poison, and this division can be seen not just on the categories like refugees, people in the army, and people in the prayer. The division can be much more deeper, and our task now is to build bridge between different groups and keep this unity in this genocidal war, because we can't afford ourselves to be separated.
Thank you.
And probably, if you allow me, I will say about unity with the democratic countries, because it's also a part of the game. What I see, I live in Kyiv, and my native cities is constantly being shelled, not just by Russian rockets, but also by Iranian drones. Syria voted for Russia in UN General Assembly. China helped Russia to bypass the sanctions and to import the Western technologies, which is critical to warfare. North Korea sent Russia more than 1 million artillery shells. Iran, China, North Korea, Syria, it's different countries. But they have a very main feature which unites them. All these regimes who captured power in these countries have a common idea of what about a human being is. Authoritarian regimes always deprive people of rights and freedoms. Opposite, democratic countries aimed to work and to develop the space for human rights and freedoms for their society. And there is no way to negotiate it, because only existence of free world will pose as threats to the autocrats. And that is why I want to once again to emphasize, it's not Ukrainian war, as I hear from the news, even today in 24 of February 2022. It's not even the war between two states, Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And you know what? 80% of people in the globe now living in the non-free or partially free society. People who have rights to believe in a God which they choose, to love the person whom they choose, and to vote for political parties whom they choose, are minority. It's just 20%. We are losing freedom in the world, which means that we need unity between democracies.
Mr. Okay, let's the round of applause. Göthberg. Sweden, together with a number of the Scandinavian states, are the most democratic states in the globe. And they're one of the most adherent and trusted supporters of Ukraine in this war. So the democracy, doesn't kind of bother the democratic societies. It's not an obstacle to support Ukraine fully, not to make it like a local domestic political issue. And I should also say that Sweden did probably one of the most important things in supporting Ukraine in its victory. It's starting the path to join the NATO. But what are the questions in the Swedish society? What are the questions in the Swedish parliament? How to pursue this support and to understand that it would be there not just for as long as it would be as considerable as possible?
Well, thank you so much. There is no discussion in Sweden about this, because we have a broad majority, all 8 parties in the parliament that are totally in fully agreement that we need to support Ukraine, not as long as it takes, but until Ukraine wins the war. And that is a fundamental difference. And that means also, when you look at the Swedish domestic debate about it, that Ukraine isn't really there because we already support it. This last week, the defense minister, who I saw will be here in a couple of minutes in the agenda, announced that Sweden now will support Ukraine with a new military aid package of $683 million in worth. And that was applauded by everyone. And even the opposition are now preparing, they say, a contra package to the government package, which would be bigger. So now we are competing each other about how to support as much as possible. One thing that I think is very important, however, is that and I think that many people in this room agree with me, that I'm so sick and tired of the discussions on fatigue. And the only thing I think about the discussion on fatigue is that there's a fatigue in the discussion about fatigue. And if you look at, for example, the Swedish society, it is, of course, standing behind Ukraine. You can see in small villages up in the high north of Sweden, monthly and weekly rallies supporting Ukraine. And of course, that means something else to a lot of Swedes, as we have been accepting Ukrainian refugees coming to our schools and being a part of our society. One thing that I think is very important also to stress is that if you look at what Ukraine is doing itself when it comes to the path towards the European Union, for example, I saw that this last week, some days ago, the Verkhovna Rada passed a bill or legislation on the capital market reform. Name one other country in the midst of a war against Russia or a nuclear power that could pass a bill on capital market reforms in the midst of war. That really shows the determination. And one last point. I think that there's a total agreement also in this room regarding this, that the military support must increase. I think it's also important for us to broaden the unity beyond the political class. To see, for example, bring all the mayors of Sweden to Ukraine for 1 week. Get to know Ukrainian mayors. Elaborate how we can deepen the development and deepen the cooperation between our countries. Connect the dots between what's happening here, what's happening in Belarus, what's happening inside Russia, and make this very clear, not only to the political class going to interesting conferences like this one, but also to members of the whole society. That is how we can keep Ukraine high on the agenda and continue our support to victory.
We have a bit, thank you. We have a bit of the time. My question still would be to Metropolitan Epiphany. So just last week, one of the Orthodox Church priests has been killed during the occupation, just one of many who suffered. I talked just 2 weeks ago about another priest from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from Kherson who has been abducted during the early stage of occupation. But we're speaking about other religious people. That would be the Baptists from Berdyansk, there would be Jewish people, there would be of very various religion. And I understand you cooperate and work. However, at the same time, such personalities like Tucker Carlson in particular, is really working hard into spreading in the US among American voters and conservative voters the idea about some kind of religious persecution in Ukraine, the concerns about the Russian Orthodox Church. What would be also the message for the people in this room to explain the religious freedoms and cooperation between different groups and different religions in Ukraine?
We are talking about democracy, and democracy requires also freedom of faith. And we have to say that Ukraine, among all European countries, is the most favorable country where freedom of faith is the broadest and the biggest. And we have all Ukrainian Council of Churches. We are all different, but we have the consensus, and we take decisions and make statements. So we have freedom of faith in this, because talking about democracy where there is no freedom of faith is impossible. And what we see in the occupied territories, this is really terror. And this is terrorism. The Russian Federation, they are killing our priests and members of our clergy. It's been so for 2 years only with our denomination. More than 10 priests have been killed. Many of the priests in the occupied territories are detained. Recently, one of them was deported to Georgia. He was kicked out of the country, and he was dropped and dumped actually at the border. That's attitude towards our faith and other faiths, because we are actually pariahs there, and our priests have to leave the temporary occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which have been occupied for a long time. And Amsterdam came to Kyiv, and we know that they are talking about persecution, but instead at the Parliament we are discussing the institutional relations with the aggressor country. We are against the situation when religious organizations are weaponized and manipulated, and Putin can be successful in that. And there are some religious organizations that disguise as Ukrainian and have it as part of their name, but they are institutionally related to the aggressor country. And for 2 years now, we have actually discontinued any kind of relations. We prohibited pro-Russian parties at the parliament, pro-Russian media, but the aggressor country cannot weaponize religious organizations. And that's why we have full freedom of faith. So without this, we would have had the situation as in the occupied territories. It's all legal in our country. It's all legitimate. We act as a democratic country. So there is a comment from the audience.
So we have the question from the audience and from our soldiers.
Good evening. Democracy, unity, corruption. There are three different words, three different notions. For me, as a military officer, corruption is synonymous to corrosion. Corrosion on our clips, corruption on our cartridges and our ammunition. That's the principal problem. And hadn't it been for the war, we would have played with this maybe for a long time, but it's only in democratic society, united society, that we can fight corruption and become an epitome of a country being able to defeat corruption, defeat the enemy, and progress for the benefit of all these Ukrainians, so that when people hear this word Ukraine, feel respect, so that we can feel pride for being Ukrainians and staying with Ukraine, our country. We can have just one.
We can have one question from the floor if you have. If not, okay, please. Ask.
Thank you very much. I think the discussion about democracy and autocracy in the world, the panel and the previous panel has been discussing fighting between autocracy and democracy. So the question to panelists, when democracy can stop being democracy because it needs a bit of autocracy to win over autocracy? Thank you.
Oleksandra, you will start.
I think that we have to remember that in this Russia's war against Ukraine, we are fighting not just only for our territory, but also for our democratic choice to build a country where the rights of everybody are protected, government is accountable, judiciary is independent, and police do not beat students who are peacefully demonstrating. And we are paying the highest price just for this chance. And for us to win the war with Russia and to transfer to Russia itself have no sense. Even more, the small Russia will never defeat the big Russia. And that is why we have to find a balance between two logic. Logic of war, we need centralization, we need limitation of human rights and freedom due to security requirements, and democratization logic, because we now on the way to European Union, and we have to demonstrate success. It's very difficult. All countries who made democratization in peaceful time know that it takes enormous efforts and enormous energy. But we have to be a first country on the future EU member who has to make such democratization during the time of large-scale war. It's difficult, but I'm looking future with optimism, because I know that according to all sociological survey, when you open it, and people in Ukraine in 2022 or 2014 were asked, what is the main value for them? People in Ukraine always put freedom in the first place on hierarchy of values.
Thank you. And Mr. Göthberg.
I agree totally, and just to say, I was born in the mid-90s, and my first time in Ukraine was 9 years ago. I've never been in Ukraine at peace. But I've been in Ukraine for the past 9 years in a democracy. And the thing we need to deal with is the peace thing, not the democracy thing. And I think that is very vital for us to remember. And also to remember that a lot of things are being done when it comes to transparency, corruption. Things are moving. not as fast as one could have wished altogether at all times, but things are moving, and we need to have respect for those democratic processes, because in a short while, in some years, Ukraine will be a very, very active and profound member of the European Union, where democratic principles are at the backbone, and that is very important to remember as well.
Thank you. I think that would be the end, as we already taken a bit more time. And thank you for being so brief, but making it so sharp.